I would like to welcome Dr. Dominic D'Agostino to the fifth annual Grove City College Exercise Science Symposium. So Dr. D'Agostino is an associate professor in the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology at the University of South Florida, Morsani College of Medicine. He is also a research scientist at the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition, and he is also one of the leading researchers in the field of ketosis. So we'd like to welcome Dr. D'Agostino to the Exercise Science Symposium. So the topic of this year's symposium is take control of your health and kind of focusing more on the wellness, exercise, and nutrition component. So I wanted to start off with, what led you to become one of the world-leading scientists in this field? And can you please elaborate on your kind of academic background and your early education, and what was maybe the pivotal moment in your career that made you decide to study, ketosis or more metabolic therapies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always had an interest in nutrition, right? As an undergrad, I majored in nutrition and biology at Rutgers University. And I realized in the early 90s to mid 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of opportunities in nutrition, really. I could work for industry or kind of go the academic route, but it was kind of thought of like more of like a soft science, I guess. But I knew I was very passionate about it, and the courses that I learned the most from were my advanced nutrition courses, which were like advanced nutritional, I describe them as nutritional biochemistry or nutrition physiology, really.
Yeah.
So, as I progressed in my undergrad research, I thought I would have a better chance getting into medical school if I double majored in biology too. So I double majored in biology, and I started doing research, a senior thesis project on the neural control of autonomic regulation. So how the brainstem mechanisms control oxygen sensing mechanisms, or cardiorespiratory output. So how our respiration and our cardiovascular system were kind of like integrated in the brainstem. And this autonomic regulation, the centers of the brain that regulate those two systems are juxtaposed to one another. And I studied the oxygen sensing mechanisms of those neurons and how they interrelate to one another. And I continued to have an interest in diving physiology because I was doing recreational diving, as a PhD student. And also when I was studying these brain cell populations, not only was I manipulating oxygen to determine how low oxygen impacts respiratory drive, but also manipulating energy systems, including glucose and including like lactate, not ketones yet, but this is back in the mid 90s to late 1990s. And then early 2000s, when I finished my PhD, I went to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Wright State University near Ohio State, actually not too far away. And that was really focused on oxygen toxicity seizures. And these seizures are very difficult to predict, and there was no mitigation strategy to prevent them in the Navy SEAL divers who use a closed circuit rebreathing apparatus in their diving missions. So a lot of my effort was spent developing technologies to give insight to understand what's happening fundamentally from a cellular and molecular mechanism point of view that would cause these seizures. So in the process of studying what's causing these seizures, and primarily focusing on drugs, I discovered that the ketogenic diet was used to prevent seizures when drugs fail. So I thought it was kind of interesting that nutrition, something I was interested in years ago as an undergrad, and I continue to have an interest because just from a general health perspective, from a fitness perspective, I was interested in the ketogenic diet, but I didn't really have the best opinion of it because I thought it was a radical diet, kind of like a fad diet. I didn't even understand or didn't even know that the ketogenic diet was the standard of care for epilepsy back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, until the 60s, until drugs started, anti-epileptic drugs started coming on and used clinically. So as I delved into it, I thought it was very exciting for me to integrate nutrition back into my neuroscience experiments and essentially studying nutritional neuroscience
Mhm.
and fundamentally studying the neuroprotective role that the ketogenic diet could have or supplemental ketones could have as a countermeasure to prevent oxygen toxicity seizures. So about 10 years ago, I received my first funding to understand how various ketone molecules, including beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and supplemental forms of these could be administered prior to exposure to high oxygen and looking at the efficacy of these compounds and the dosing of the compounds that would be needed and looking at the latency to seizure. And we do this in rat studies now, and we have a ketogenic diet study at Duke University now actually looking at humans exposed to high oxygen.
Mhm.
And so it was about 10 years ago, just doing, really basic fundamental neuroscience investigations. I was looking at oxygen toxicity as it relates to elevated free radicals in the brain. And we noted that ketones knock down some of the free radicals in the brain. So that was an interesting observation. And I was really focused on free radical generation because that's kind of what my postdoc was on, developing technologies to image oxygen free radicals in the brain. And the first observations were that ketones were knocking down the free radicals. But the more I looked into it, the free radicals were coming from the mitochondria, and the mitochondria generate ATP, the energy currency of the cell, and the ketones were not quenching reactive oxygen species per se, but preventing them from being generated altogether. So they were kind of I was working downstream with various drugs to quench oxygen free radicals, looking at superoxide and catalase mimetics, but by targeting the actual energy production in the mitochondria and preventing molecular oxygen from accepting an electron and becoming superoxide dismutase by enhancing the flow of electrons in the mitochondria to make ATP, and ketones do that by oxidizing Q in the semi-ubiquinone site. So you have a more efficient flow of electrons through the mitochondria and generation of ATP, simultaneously making less superoxide anion. So this is what I observed essentially in the microscope from the various technologies that we developed. And that was about 10 years ago. And then that really became the stepping stone for me to just, really focus all my time and effort into looking at how therapeutic ketosis could be applied to seizure disorders, various neurological disorders. And a year or two after that, I had a PhD student, Angela Poff, who Dr. Angela Poff now, she's a research associate with me now, and she wanted to do a cancer project. So we started looking at cancer, and then later on, I had a student, Andrew Kutnick, who is doing his PhD now on using a ketogenic strategy to mitigate the muscle wasting associated with cancer cachexia. So we have that project. And so a lot of projects kind of came out of the Department of Defense research that I was describing with oxygen toxicity. So we have probably a half dozen or so more projects going on right now. And, I could talk about a variety of different projects, but that's really how it evolved. Basically going from drug research, anti-epileptic drug research, to identifying the ketogenic diet as being a potential, useful tool in oxygen toxicity.
Okay, very nice. So, you're a very widely published author, highly cited. Now, of all the studies that you have done or maybe are currently doing, which one do you think has stood out the most to you? Or which one would you say, has changed your thinking or maybe even your own personal behavior?
My personal behavior.
Maybe even changing your own lifestyle. For those who maybe don't follow you on Twitter, I see you do a lot of self-experimentation, right? So did any of those studies like really stood out? And like, wow, I'm gonna, instead of, because sometimes people like preach a lot about something, but they don't actually do it themselves. So any of those studies that you've done actually change your mind, or maybe even like change your own lifestyle?
Yeah, I think not only the studies that we did, but the studies that were done way before I even got into this area. And I did have a lot of doubts that the ketogenic diet could be used in the setting of gaining muscle and gaining strength. And there was a study that I was an author on with Antonio Paoli, looking at elite gymnasts. And in that study, he asked me to be on that study, and he gave me the protocol and kept me up to date as they were doing the study. And I remember it was around the same time I was a few months into, had an intense interest in the study that he was conducting in Italy, because I had just started implementing the ketogenic diet and was also, hitting the gym about 3 times a week and lifting pretty heavy. And I pretty much found the same thing in doing body composition measurements, and also, looking at my strength over time. I was able to retain lean body mass and retain my strength in all the major lifts after implementing the ketogenic diet for, I think it was 8 to 10 months. I had been on it when I was working on that paper and analyzing the data, from the gymnasts. And I remember, I originally got into this as a neuroscientist as a means to enhance brain resilience in extreme environments. So that's a much different application than sports. But the profound body composition alterations that were observed in the elite gymnasts and the body composition alterations that I saw in myself, I guess, not so much gaining muscle size, but being able to preserve that muscle size while losing body fat and increasing my power to weight ratio. And I'll use an example of like push-ups and chin-ups and things like that. In dips, I was able to significantly increase sort of my reps with my own body weight, and also increase, for example, being able to deadlift 3 times my body weight. I had not been able to do that before, but after being on the diet for about 1.5 to 2 years, I remember doing, for the first time, being able to deadlift 3 times my body weight for a set of 5. So that was something I never could do prior to the ketogenic diet. So it changed my opinion. I thought the diet was a muscle wasting diet, and that your body would catabolize your skeletal protein to maintain glucose. But ketones are very protein sparing. And that brings me back to a study that had a remarkable effect. I mean, you asked me for a study that had a big effect. It was that study that I co-authored with my colleagues Antonio Paoli in Italy. But I was very inspired by the work of George Cahill and his observation that fasting subjects for 40 days could fundamentally change brain energy metabolism, and brain metabolism could shift from the use of glucose as the primary energy source almost exclusively to the use of ketone bodies, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. And after about 10 days, about 2/3 of brain energy metabolism was being fueled off ketones. So that has profound implications for a number of different neurological disorders, but also has profound implications for skeletal muscle, because the production of ketones through beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver, those ketone bodies then become the alternative fuel for the brain, which is a very big glucose sink. So it has very high glucose requirements, or very high energy requirements in the absence of fuel, right? So transitioning the brain metabolism from glucose to ketones prevents the catabolism of gluconeogenic amino acids in skeletal muscle. So by virtue of ketones being an alternative fuel, they are very protein sparing and very anti-catabolic, we would say.
Yeah.
And I think, to sort of demonstrate that the ketones could be an effective fuel for the brain, Dr. Cahill and Oliver Owen injected subjects with insulin that caused peripheral glucose disposal in peripheral tissues, drop blood glucose down into the 1 millimolar range, which is universally fatal. That's what we learn when we teach the medical students, in my lectures, or we learn that a certain level of glucose would be fatal. It would cause a coma and then ultimately would be fatal. He demonstrated quite convincingly that the subjects, could preserve their cognitive function, and they were actually asymptomatic for hypoglycemia when their glucose levels got down to 1 to 2 millimolar. That's about 20 milligrams per deciliter, range. So these studies were very inspiring to me because no one knew of them, for one thing, even though they were done at Harvard, they were published in a good journal, but they had profound implications for many different diseases, from Alzheimer's disease, where you have glucose hypometabolism, where epilepsy, which is thought to be a dysregulation of energy homeostasis in the brain, Parkinson's disease, ALS, many different what we would call neurometabolic disorders of the brain, like glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency syndrome. These rare disorders had the ketogenic diet as the standard of care, and it became very obvious to me that these ketones were circumventing the normal metabolic pathways that the brain uses, with glucose, using the glucose transporter or pyruvate dehydrogenase complex to generate through glucose oxidation. So I became increasingly interested in applying therapeutic ketosis to many different animal models of disease. And now we're even looking at a genetic disease called Kabuki syndrome. And it's a very unique scenario where we think that the ketones may be having an epigenetic effect on the methylation of genes and may be imparting a therapeutic effect in that way. So some work was done at Johns Hopkins, and we have collaborated with the investigator of that, and we are breeding up the mice that have Kabuki syndrome, and we are just starting pilot studies now, and which will ultimately hopefully lead to human clinical trials where therapeutic ketosis in the form of supplemental ketones can be used to treat a genetic disorder. And we're not changing the genetic disorder per se. There's still a persistent molecular pathology, but we're sort of therapeutic ketosis symptomatically helps with this disorder, and also fundamentally we think is actually altering through epigenetic effects gene regulation that would otherwise be silenced in this disorder. So we've gone off in areas that I never would have predicted. And now a big focus of what we're doing now is skeletal muscle wasting, preventing that, muscle strength. And we're also moving, it's exciting to see that we're moving things from rodent models into human studies. So at Duke University and the work that we'll be doing on NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, NASA NEMO, it's a space analog mission. Ultimately, we're collecting baseline data on a wide variety of physiological, biochemical, and metabolic parameters. And then the idea is to understand what these extreme environments do to sleep, to body composition, to muscle strength, to metabolic parameters, to cognitive function, microbiome we're looking at. And then ultimately develop and optimize a countermeasure that would enhance or preserve normal physiology, normal hormonal, metabolic, and performance parameters in that extreme environment. So that's what we're kind of deep into doing that right now. And we're preparing for the second NEMO mission that we've been involved in. I was a crew member for the first one. My wife will actually be a crew member on the upcoming mission. So we're doing all the IRBs and doing all the training that's associated now.
Okay, very nice. Now, you've done obviously a lot of work on ketogenic diets and even exogenous ketones supplements. Can you just explain what is ketosis? How do you get into that state of ketosis? And what's the so what of that? I mean, is there any proven health benefits of being in that state?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the state of ketosis, has historically been thought of as a pathological condition primarily associated with type 1 diabetes, where you have an insufficiency of insulin. In the absence of insulin, you have a dysregulation of metabolic physiology, and you have runaway ketogenesis. So because insulin is used to regulate to get ketone production. So the suppression of insulin elevates ketone production. So if you don't have insulin, you could produce too much. So there are different ways. That's pathological diabetic ketoacidosis. It's a very unique condition that's more or less specific to type 1 diabetes. What I'm going to talk about now is actually therapeutic ketosis, which can be achieved primarily in three ways, right? You could do fasting. If you stop eating today, in about 24 hours, your body will enter a state of mild ketosis after you burn off, the glycogen that's in your liver. You have about 2,000 calories of glycogen in the liver. So after about 24 to 48 hours, you burn that off, and then you start mobilizing fatty acids for fuel. The fatty acids do not cross the blood-brain barrier well. So our liver converts these fatty acids to beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. And these ketones spill into the blood, and they provide energy to our brain and peripheral tissues. That would be a state of fasting ketosis. It can be hard to achieve for many people, but it does have therapeutic effects, anti-inflammatory. We hear a lot about intermittent fasting. So we're sort of getting the benefits of fasting through time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. So that's one way to achieve it. And these ways are not mutually exclusive. So if you do one way, I'm going to describe three ways. You could actually add them all together. So I'm going to describe fasting, the ketogenic diet, and then supplemental ketones. The ketogenic diet is a macronutrient profile that's high in fat, anywhere from 65 to 90% fat clinically, moderate protein, typically anywhere between 12 to 25 and upwards of 30% protein, with the balance of calories being from carbohydrates, typically no more than 10%, usually around 5% carbohydrates in the form of non-glycemic fibrous carbohydrates. When you eat a macronutrient ratio that is what I just described, that changes metabolic physiology in a way that mimics, in some ways, the state of fasting. It suppresses the hormone insulin and stimulates fatty acid oxidation in peripheral tissues, but also in the liver. And then you enter a state of what's called nutritional ketosis. And that is a state where insulin is low, ketone bodies are elevated, and blood glucose is generally very stable and low. And that state is therapeutically used clinically to manage epilepsy, or specifically now drug-resistant epilepsy. And when I got into this 10 years ago, it was exclusively pediatric epilepsy, and now it has probably over 24 therapeutic applications over just the last decade that I've been studying this. And I would say 12 of them are proven, and I would say roughly 12 of them have emerging science behind them. For example, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, that would be the emerging sort of applications, where things like pediatric epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, PDH, deficiency. These are like proven. There's many proven and emerging, and we tend to focus on the emerging applications. It's very exciting, and especially moving it to clinical trials. So that's one way, but the problem with therapeutically, clinically implementing the ketogenic diet is that it's very hard to do with patients because eating is a lifestyle. Medical doctors are not nutritionists. They typically have to hire a registered dietitian to implement this in patients. So we've put a large, amount of time and effort to develop strategies that would allow us to circumvent the dietary restrictions and still produce a state of therapeutic ketosis. And we do that with the development of exogenous ketone supplementation. And that could be a ketone ester, which probably is more suited for clinical scenarios or maybe military applications, to various ketone mineral salts where beta-hydroxybutyrate can be combined with sodium, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And that salt, it's a very simple molecule with an ionic bond between the beta-hydroxybutyrate and the monovalent or divalent cation. It forms a bond and it dissociates in the gut, and it delivers beta-hydroxybutyrate and a monovalent or divalent cation to your body. These are electrolytes that your body can use. So you could rapidly enter a state of ketosis, maintain that state if you do the dosing correctly. And we also look at medium chain triglyceride oil, which is a type of fat that does not get packaged into chylomicrons like long-chain fatty acids, but goes to the liver via hepatic portal circulation and rapidly gets oxidized through beta oxidation in the liver to produce these ketone bodies. So you have a ketogenic fat and you have a ketone mineral salt. Those two things can be combined together. They are commercially available. You can go to pretty much any nutrition store. I saw Walmart has it now. Target has it. So a person can conceivably go to their local Walmart and buy these ketogenic supplements and implement them as a lifestyle, or to further augment the therapeutic efficacy of the ketogenic diet, or they could potentially be used without the diet itself. So we do a lot of experiments where we feed animals a standard rodent chow that's high in carbohydrates, and we mix in as a percentage of the food up to 10, 15, 20, up to 30% of the calories, or by weight actually, of the ketone supplements. And we find it to be therapeutic for a number of things. Also, probably most importantly for the general population, is that we start to see interesting effects like lowering blood glucose, anti-anxiety effects, perhaps an increase in motor function under certain parameters. So they're the things that we're studying now. And as it relates to military operations, IHMC, which I work for the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, which is in Pensacola and Ocala, they have a number of research programs right now looking at the effects of a ketone monoester, beta-hydroxybutyrate monoester, on human performance and as it relates to cognitive function, and then exercise performance, including speed, sprinting, and endurance.
Interesting. So
yes.
We did a study last year with the exogenous ketone supplement that you provided feedback on, and that's in review right now at the Journal Strength and Conditioning Research. And then we're doing a study right now, kind of a follow-up to that. So it'll be interesting to see what the results is, because that's more with human performance, and we can talk about that maybe a little bit later, because there's not a lot of tons of data on either on ketogenic diets and sports performance, or obviously now kind of this emerging field of kind of ketone supplements and sports performance. But I think you would agree that, say, ketogenic diets is not necessarily for everyone, right? Yeah. But who do you see it work? Who do you see the kind of it work best for?
Yeah, I think, just going back to the supplements, I think the ketogenic diet is definitely not for everyone, right? I met with a few people yesterday, and one person did not have a gallbladder, And her doctor put her on a ketogenic diet for a particular disorder, and she had a violent response because she couldn't digest fat.
Yeah.
And the doctor didn't know. The doctor knew that she didn't have a gallbladder, but didn't put two and two together that she couldn't metabolize, the fat
Yeah.
for energy. So these are some of the obvious things that doctors may not trained in nutrition may
Yeah.
not understand. But I think for the everyday person, ketone supplements are appealing because the ketone molecule is a source of energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I was an undergrad, an interesting supplement hit the market in the early 1990s, and that was creatine monohydrate.
Yeah.
And, creatine monohydrate can be consumed orally, and it helps the body generate ATP
Mm-hmm.
through creatine phosphate, right?
Yeah.
So in a similar way, ketone bodies can be consumed orally, and they help the body. They help your mitochondria and your cells generate ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. So they just represent an alternative fuel. In the case of ketones, they can be probably more suited to enhance brain energy metabolism and also more suited for enhancing energy production under endurance events. Whereas creatine monohydrate can elevate muscle stores of creatine, which can help to maintain ATP production under strenuous anaerobic exercise. I think ketones may shine in the context of situations where your glucose stores are depleted, being in a state of ketosis. And as a neuroscientist, I believe that their most valuable function is centrally mediated. I believe in the central governor hypothesis, sort of, right? If you provide the brain with steady and efficient fuel flow and keep the brain happy by energizing it, your brain will be able to fire signals to muscles to cause stronger contractions. And so therefore, by enhancing the energetic effects, by energizing the central nervous system, you can enhance athletic performance by enhancing neurotransmitter production, by stabilizing brain energy metabolism. That can have a crossover effect on enhancing cognitive function, but also exercise performance. So that's my belief, and I'm kind of sticking to it, but the data's not there yet. So we hope to be able to do some of these studies, in particular in extreme environments where we know physical function is compromised due to a dysregulation of brain function. So, or in a situation where we think glucose hypometabolism is a consequence of these extreme environments, and that's impairing cognitive function and physical performance. And we think that ketones can help to restore central nervous system function to preserve and perhaps even optimize physical and cognitive function and things like reaction time in these extreme environments. So that's an extreme environment, but exercise under extreme conditions is an extreme environment. And I think really that's where therapeutic ketosis or exogenous ketones, or maybe even the ketogenic diet could shine. Theoretically, you could do intermittent fasting, which puts you into a state of ketosis. And then when you eat during a specific window of time, you could eat a ketogenic low-carb meal, and then you could supplement ketones too around that time. So I described 3 ways to get into a state of ketosis, but I think what's really exciting to me and even, the people in our lab is that these things can be combined together. And there's also various forms of ketones. We can mix MCT with beta-hydroxybutyrate salts and then with ketone esters, and then we can work on the ratios of the various ketones. And we think that specific types of exercise and maybe specific disorders may be more responsive to different ketone formulations. We know, for example, that you need to elevate acetoacetate to get an anti-seizure effect. So a beta-hydroxybutyrate ester will not work. So you have to. So that's just one example.
Yeah.
For the everyday person, I think they could start out with a ketone supplement or just low carb, because the ketogenic diet is kind of hard to follow, and see if they get benefits from that.
Yeah. No, that's I think anybody listening or anybody who's interested in doing research, I think you brought up an interesting point of, kind of, I don't think there's been that study like looking at intermittent fasting or combining intermittent fasting with ketogenic diets with a ketone supplement. You can
Yeah.
have, just hearing you talk, I mean, that interests me, maybe doing a study like that, having different groups and seeing, I mean,
Yeah.
I can't even remember or just think on the top of my head, like a study, like actually comparing, say, ketogenic diets or low carb diet combined with intermittent fasting compared to just kind of the condition by itself, let alone combining it with, say, an exogenous ketone supplement. So yeah, let's do that study.
Yeah, I think we should. It's interesting. 10 years ago in 2009, I had presented this idea to the Alzheimer's Center that because there was some data showing, that ketones maybe could have a therapeutic effect, and it was like hard to get these patients into a state of ketosis, with the
Yeah.
diet.
Yeah.
So my recommendation was to, and this was an animal study, not even a human study, was to do intermittent fasting and then a ketogenic diet during the eating window, in addition to ketone supplementation, which could be even incorporated into the diet or into the water that they would drink during the fasting phase. That was thought of as something so bizarre and radical, and like the committee was like, who would ever do intermittent fasting and
Yeah.
do a ketogenic diet and take a ketone supplement? That is not feasible. But I do it, and I
Yeah.
know other people that do it.
Hmm.
And for someone who has a devastating disease like Alzheimer's disease, I think could be a very novel, approach to
Yeah.
metabolically managing, glucose hypometabolism, which
Yeah.
is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. I mean, it would seem that the physiology or the biochemistry is there. It's just that we need more, studies
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that topic. So yeah, yeah, for sure. Going back to kind of more the health aspects, and I think most people know and understand that there's a big chronic disease epidemic, right? Globally, but specifically in the United States with obesity, right? About 40% of the population is obese, or 70% of the population are overweight or obese. Over 50% of the population are either pre-diabetic, diabetic, so insulin resistance is a big problem. Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease, cancer, etc. So I mean, it affects everybody. Everybody knows somebody with a chronic disease or a health condition.
Yeah.
I was interested to see, so obviously you can talk maybe about, because all these things that you're mentioning, right? Intermittent fasting, low carb or ketogenic diets, right? Or maybe ketone supplements, it definitely has a role in that. But maybe first off, I don't know if you've ever talking about this or have a theory as to this chronic disease epidemic that we are facing. Um, because it's fairly new to human history. And if you go back even just,
Yeah.
60, 70 years ago, we didn't, I mean, sure, people had those conditions, but it wasn't in epidemic proportions. And,
Rare.
that's the case today. What would you say, kind of might be some of the contributing factors to that, and what might be some of the solutions going forward?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I definitely feel that it's linked to the food that we're eating, and also to our eating behavior on
Mm,
top of that.
mm,
So three things just off the top of my head that you see that you kind of highlighted was, people are overweight or obese, and they have a dysregulation of glucose and insulin homeostasis, and they also have chronically high inflammation too, are the three things that I see in a lot of the blood work. I mean, I just met with some first responders yesterday. I met with some police officers. A couple have been contacting me, even a lot of guys in the military. And it's, the metabolic syndrome, which is elevated fasting insulin, elevated glucose up into the 200 milligrams per nanometer range, like in a fasting,
mm,
and also, being significantly overweight,
mm,
and some of these guys that they also lift weights too, but so they are they have a significant amount of muscle, but also a significant amount of fat. Some of the service guys that I talk with. So, and it's interesting to see their response to a low carb diet. It does not even have to be a ketogenic diet. Yeah. They have tried everything to manage their weight. And I think contributing to their weight problem or insulin resistance is the crazy schedules that they have, like working from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. or something like that, like working these crazy night shifts on top of that, and the food that they eat. But there has been no other strategy to bring down their glucose and let them lose weight than the ketogenic diet or low carb diet. They're kind of calling it ketogenic, but I think from the feedback that they give me, they're basically keeping, total carbs under 50 to 75 grams a day, but they were coming from 300 or 400 grams a day. And that has a profound effect on their hemoglobin A1C, their fasting blood glucose, their insulin. And I think more importantly, after these numbers drop, you start to see the C-reactive protein drop. And you can measure it with high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and that starts to go way down. And that's if you have chronically elevated systemic inflammation over time, that's going to make you age faster. That's going to do a lot of damage to your body, your cardiovascular system, your brain. If you have systemic inflammation, you have neuroinflammation, and neuroinflammation can really be devastating, like over time. Yeah. So, and then your blood pressure goes down too, because in part you're suppressing the hormone insulin, which helps you excrete a lot of excess sodium. So your blood volume goes down as your weight goes down, as your glucose gets managed, as your insulin. And low carb dieting, or just simply starting out eliminating processed carbohydrates and sugars, is the first step. And you usually see really profound changes in important metabolic biomarkers or health biomarkers within the first week or two. So that's very satisfying. You have an acute beneficial effects, and then chronically over time, you start to see pretty significant changes in body composition, and also in things like inflammation over time. Okay. So I guess maybe getting back to maybe your original question is what's causing the insulin, what's causing the obesity epidemic, and I think it's a combination of a lot of people debate this, as you probably see on Twitter and social media. I really do think that chronic consumption of processed carbohydrates in a subset of the population that's pretty significant, like 30% or more, leads to a dysregulation of appetite control mechanisms that result in an overconsumption of calories, primarily in the form of processed carbohydrates, that leads to a calorie surplus, that leads to, weight gain, insulin resistance, hyperglycemia. And I think that one way to moderate and control our eating behavior is to not eat a diet that causes wide fluctuations in glucose and insulin, right? Because a postprandial dip in blood glucose from an insulin spike will cause us to crave carbohydrates again, or crave food in general, and for us to overeat, and it becomes a vicious cycle. That vicious cycle can be significantly attenuated, if not abolished, if you eat a diet that controls your glucose and insulin response. And I believe in most people, a ketogenic diet, especially in people where diets have failed to help them control their eating behavior, if you just have the if it fits your macros approach, or the Weight Watchers approach, right, you'll be calorie deprived, because you really do need, and this is an important concept, you need to have a calorie deficit to lose weight. So, and I know maybe you've talked with people and interviewed people who don't necessarily believe that you need a calorie deficit to lose weight, but I think all the science would support that, over time. And so I think of a low carb diet or ketogenic diet as a means to sustain, to induce and sustain a calorie deficit that's needed to impact those biomarkers that I talked about.
Yeah, I mean, this is you're kind of touching there this whole debate about, is it all about calories, or is about something else. And I know David Ludwig and some of the books that he's written or the work that they've done kind of goes more with that carbohydrate insulin model or
Yeah.
hypothesis. Where
And I think there's some truth to that.
Mhm.
There is some truth to the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, but I think it's more complicated and nuanced to that. And coming from a neuroscience background, I guess, David Ludwig kind of touches upon neural control of sort of appetite regulation and things like that. But I think it's not necessarily one or the other, but sort of a combination of factors. And the systems that control our eating behavior are very complex. And I think that they could possibly be the root cause. And there's no doubt that genetically some people are set up to store fat more efficiently, right? So there's no doubt. Right? Gary Taubes points that out. But I don't think that. I think generally speaking, I think we have an eating dysregulation instead of a physiological dysregulation for propensity for fat accumulation. That would kind of be his role. I think it's more of sort of the things that regulate our appetite and eating behavior. Yeah. I think if we target that, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. And the way that I think to target that is to stabilize glucose and insulin through feeding things that cause a proper insulin and glucose response.
Would you therefore agree that that's why some form, again, not necessarily ketogenic diets, but some form of carbohydrate restriction works so well for a lot of people? Because again, most people in today's society, like I said, if you look at the latest statistics, about 50% of adults are either pre-diabetic or diabetic, and that number could potentially be higher if you're measuring something like that Kraft insulin response or something like that, like he showed in his research.
Yeah.
So it's it's I don't think it's that far of a stretch to say that the majority of the current adult population has some form of insulin resistance, right? Mm-hmm. And would you therefore agree that again, not necessarily for all people, but for a good chunk of adults in this country, carbohydrate restriction would be very beneficial.
Yeah. I've seen it in the blood work of people. Yeah, they could have very elevated glucose and then do a ketogenic diet, and then their ketones become impressively elevated, but their glucose continues to stay elevated until they start to lose the weight, and that insulin sensitivity is increased. But it's really coupled with a calorie deficit and with weight loss. It needs to happen. So, I do believe there's people out there, David Ludwig and other people may argue that you just, change the macros and it fixes everything, but it's more of a continuous process. I think 90%, maybe 80% of that is just due to weight loss. And I think, but that weight loss can be, sustained more efficiently, with adherence to the carbohydrate restriction over time. I mean, that's the data still is not really out there to unambiguously support what I just said, but I think well-controlled studies from my observation of everything that I can read would result in that over time.
Yeah, and the whole you're talking about calorie restriction, right? Because a lot of the low-fat diets you see in like randomized controlled trials normally use some form of low-fat diet with caloric restriction. Because yes, you need to get to some form of negative energy state to lose weight. But if you start to look at the low-carb literature, most of the diets, most of the LCHF or just ketogenic diets in the literature, the RCTs, are not energy restricted. They're ad libitum. But would you then agree, because most people, they get to a negative energy state because they're more saturated, and as a result, they eat less or decrease in their appetite. Maybe ketones has something to do with that?
Yeah, that's right. These high-fat, low-carb diets are not energy restricted per se. They're not set up like that. But by through appetite regulation effects of low-carb diets, you have inadvertent calorie restriction. Even a modest calorie restriction can result in changes in these biomarkers. And I think of these studies, some of them that you might be familiar with, and others, they don't really count calories, and I think, and some of them do, some of them don't.
Yeah.
But I really think that's important, and I think that's the big lever, that's the big thing that's being influenced here.
Yeah.
I do think it's changing metabolic physiology, but you have to appreciate that, you are oxidizing more fat, but also storing more fat. So the flux of fat going in and out of the adipose tissue is higher on a high fat, low carb diet. So on a low carb diet, the flux of fat going in, you are storing less fat, I think, if it's calorie and you're oxidizing less fat. So you think, like, when I go to bed, I think I'm like fat loading, right? I'm like jamming fat into my adipose tissue, but the next day, like right now, I haven't eaten anything. I'm liberating a lot of fat from the adipose and burning fat. So I think about it. I think about it as fat flux, through adipose. It's enzymatically, biochemically, physiologically, we are set up to do that by using this strategy. And I think it has practical advantages, especially for people like that you talked about with type 2 diabetes and obesity.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about ketone supplements or exogenous ketone supplementation. So you mentioned earlier, obviously, that can be used as another strategy to kind of experience the benefits of ketosis. Obviously, from a dietary means, you have to severely restrict your carbohydrate intake, and that's not maybe the easiest thing to do for a lot of people. So therefore you see some benefit, or would you argue that's kind of the practical application of the supplements. Now, I thought about this, and you'll be able to comment much better on this, but is there any problem with just eating your regular high carb diet, say where 50% or more of the energy is coming from carbohydrate, but then you're adding the supplement on top of that, right? Because that's not, that doesn't seem normal, right? Because then you're inducing a state of ketosis for a couple of hours, but that's not normally physiologically experienced unless you do restrict your carbohydrate intake through a ketogenic diet. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I get this question a lot. So inducing a state of ketosis while you're eating a high carbohydrate diet is not typically physiological, right? So, but you could take a step back and say consuming creatine monohydrate or consuming branched chain amino acids and spiking levels of these things in the blood is not normally physiological, right?
Yeah.
So I view exogenous ketones as an energetic source of consumable energy. So in that way, they are a fourth macronutrient. So it would be like consuming glucose or consuming carbohydrates and consuming fat. The body will use what's available. So if you are consuming a high carbohydrate diet and using glucose as a fuel source, and you consume exogenous ketones, the exogenous ketones will be elevated in the blood and they will be used as fuel. Just like, if you eat fat, the fat will be used as fuel. And I believe that a lot of people will say the ketones get used preferentially over glucose in the brain or in tissues. I don't think there's really a whole lot of evidence for that unless, for example, as we age, there's impaired glucose metabolism in the brain over time, and then that impairment of ketone metabolism is not observed. So ketones may be the preferred fuel under conditions where you have impaired glucose metabolism, glucose transporter deficiency, PDH complex deficiency, things like that. Glucose or ketones may be the preferred fuel. But I basically just think if you're adding ketones on top of a high carb diet, your body will use them as a source of energy like it would otherwise, perhaps more efficiently if it's a low carb diet, because your system will be more like quote unquote hungry for energy.
Yeah.
So that may enhance the uptake. So it may enhance the transport of ketones across the blood-brain barrier, across cells, across mitochondria by upregulating the transporters, and maybe by enhancing the ketolytic enzymes that are responsible for turning the ketones into energy. We think that these systems get upregulated in the presence of ketones, and perhaps with a glucose or insulin deficiency may upregulate these mechanisms that would enable the body to more efficiently transport and utilize ketones for energy.
So would you say there is a metabolic benefit or health benefit from being in any state of some form of light nutritional ketosis, whether that is through ketogenic diets, or obviously now you can just buy the supplement, put it in some water or mix it up and drink it. So you're saying that is another possible therapeutic option that might be part or become part of some type of strategy to help with some of these kind of chronic diseases, especially most of them are kind of cardiometabolic conditions.
I think the early data would suggest that. So perhaps a decrease in inflammation, a better regulation of blood glucose, maybe enhance insulin sensitivity. And undoubtedly, if you're adding ketones to the system, you're giving a source of energy, and it's a source of energy that the brain can use quite effectively. So you're doing all those things. We do have evidence, too, that if you consume glucose or ketones acutely, the glucose levels drop. And the drop in glucose seems to be proportional to the elevation of ketones. So therapeutically, in people who have a hard time managing their blood glucose levels, exogenous ketones may help. I met with an individual yesterday who I gave him ketone salts, and he has the lowest glucose numbers he's ever had. So, and he's been religiously tracking his data, and he's just amazed that this is possible by consuming a supplement. I believe the right preparation of exogenous ketones will lower glucose more than something like metformin will.
Interesting. So
I think we need to do that study, but I think in people who have elevated glucose, the right preparation of exogenous ketones in the right dose acutely will lower glucose more than the drug metformin.
Yeah, and metformin's a commonly prescribed diabetes medication to lower blood glucose. Now, for those interested in maybe not so much in like low carb or ketogenic diets, or maybe interested in exogenous ketones, can you give some like practical applications in terms of now there's all kinds of supplements on the market. What should you be if you want, because you're always your kind of own experiment of one, right? You can always try stuff on yourself and see how it works. What should you be looking for in a supplement? How much? Doesn't matter how many times per day, the dosage, that kind of stuff. What would you say?
Yeah. Well, it depends what your goals are. That's the first thing, and the individual. And there are products on the market that have beta-hydroxybutyrate exclusively and without MCT. But I think the most effective products out there would have beta-hydroxybutyrate salts and MCT combined. And like that was a product, right, that we used for one of the studies. And I think these products are out there. Otherwise, you would a person could pick whatever preference of ketone salt product that they like based on taste or price or whatever, and then combine that product with medium chain triglycerides, either in oil form or powder form. And I think by delivering ketone salts with a ketogenic fat, it's kind of doing two things. It's delaying gastric absorption, right? And it's sustaining the elevation of ketones longer. And I think it's also buffering some of the acidity or some of the osmotic sort of effects that may happen in the gut at the time. So it may buffer some of the ketone salts that by hitting the gut with a big mineral load that can cause some issues. And I think by combining it with a fat, in particular ketogenic fat, that could be beneficial. Some people have problems with medium chain triglycerides, in that I've experimented with avocado oil powder or long chain fats in the form of powdered organic butter recently, and I can tolerate a much higher level of ketone salts if I take some of these long chain fats with it. So that's been an observation. But one of the original observations we made in the lab is that at least in a few human studies we did, just piloting in the lab, that combining beta-hydroxybutyrate salt with MCT causes an elevation of ketones greater than either one alone. And that becomes, I think, maybe important for the consumer looking to get the optimal elevation of ketones, in a product that's out there.
Okay, yeah. It's interesting, the study that we're doing right now, we're comparing one dosage of this, exogenous ketone supplement, but it's the BHB kind of MCT formulation, to two dosages compared to a placebo. We started a couple months ago. So a couple of subjects have started to go through it, and obviously we're looking at 5-kilometer running time trial performance, and obviously so it's high intensity kind of endurance performance, and our subjects are able to run 5K in about 20 minutes, some of them sub 20 minutes. So it's pretty decent, yeah. So preliminary data, interesting. I think you'll enjoy this. So obviously we don't know yet, but so far the people who have finished the study, the couple who have finished, seem to do better on the single dosage compared to the placebo and the higher dosages. So the single dosage normally is so far is resulting in blood ketones of 0.5, 0.6, something like that. The double dosage takes it above 1 millimolar. So I thought I'll throw it in there because obviously you're talking about this being another energy substrate, kind of maybe like a fourth macronutrient, and it's interesting. We'll see how it ends up, but that's more of a sports application.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would like to see, to repeat this or do another arm with a ketone ester too, ultimately. Yeah. So, but that's really interesting data that you had mentioned. And I think that could be due to a number of factors. Maybe it could be to GI tolerance of bodies. You have a kind of a load in the stomach while you're running. So I think it could lead to that could result from a variety of different things. But I've always felt that mild ketosis, for me personally, is better. I've experimented a lot with the esters, and I just don't feel normal if I jack my levels up to 4 or 5 or 6. I did that a lot early on, and I don't think it's optimal.
Yeah. Very quickly, I've heard you talk before, it seems very interesting, about maybe potentially incorporating ketones into the food supply. And do you think that's maybe something in the future, or maybe certain companies will start to do that? I'm interested if you can maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, especially the more we research ketones, like the blood glucose lowering effect. So if they were combined with foods, they could potentially attenuate that spike in blood glucose, and that could be therapeutic, for example, with type 2 diabetes. But also it's a way to just deliver a molecule that we know has potential energetic effects in addition to anti-inflammatory effects, in addition to things we're just starting to explore now, maybe anti-catabolic effects too. So they could be incorporated into different types of foods, and these foods could be sold for therapeutically. If it's a ketogenic food line, it could further augment the ketogenic diet, or if it's a sports supplement sort of food line, whether it's a bar or something like that, that would be sort of like adding creatine, right, to your pre-workout mix, right? Creatine enhances energy production in the cells. I think the same thing could happen with ketones. So I think there's potential there, but I think we're getting ahead of the science if you're already doing that. But then again, I think we have enough insight to know that something positive could happen. So it's maybe worth experimenting with, I guess.
Do you think from a few, in 10, 15 years in the future, you talk about creatine, right? When it first came out here in the 1990s, it was kind of looked at with more skepticism, right?
I remember buying creatine I believed in it. I bought creatine in 1992, and I think I spent like $80 for like 200 grams of it or something like that. And I was in high school. So I knew there was a lot. I knew it was going to be a supplement. And I remember in 1996 in my exercise science class, I got the question wrong. We had to name 3 ergogenic compounds, and I named creatine monohydrate as being an ergogenic compound for aerobic exercise. And I got that question wrong because my advisor or professor said there's no evidence for that. So that was 1996.
Yeah.
So revisit the PubMed today, and you'll see.
Yeah, you need to.
Yeah,
you need to get the point back for that.
Yeah.
But you think you think it will be same evolution? If you were to kind of think about next I don't know 10 years or so, do you think things like exogenous ketones will take the same path potentially?
I think so. I predict that it will. I think there's enough research being done, and I think it's going to be driven by the research. It's not going to be driven by marketing or anything like that. But I just like creatine. The popularity of creatine and the acceptance of it as an ergogen was primarily due to the studies that showed its efficacy. And I think we have a lot of work to do, and it's going to be probably a decade before it's fully, or at least 5 years, I think, before it's really accepted and maybe used by major sports teams like creatine is.
Yeah, good, interesting. Dom, last question. So, you said yourself, right? You're a Christian, and I wanted to ask you, obviously, so Grove City College, right, is a Christian institution. And I wanted to ask you, as a very respectable, well-known scientist, what does this integration for you look like between science and faith?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in that. I think from an undergrad through graduate school, the more I learned about science, the more I was interested in integrating faith with science. So I was inspired to read a lot of literature on the side. And I think as my understanding the science world evolved and my knowledge evolved, so did my sort of knowledge and appreciation of faith and spirituality. So I think that was a major driver of that. I think it's really the search for truth, right? I think of science as the search for truth, and I think in the empirical sense, like you're doing that with our faith. And I didn't know your college was a Christian college. I didn't know that, but that's great. But I think there is, I definitely don't think they're mutually exclusive, like maybe I did in the past. And I think that they're actually synergistic, and that I think science actually strengthened my faith.
Interesting.
And I would sort of promote that, and I think maybe encourage, knowing now that you're a Christian college, that could be sort of promoted and encouraged to seek that.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. D'Agostino, for your time. It was great to talk to you today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate your collaboration too in the studies that we're doing together.
Thank you.
Thank you.